Want to try out SQL Server, but you're too cool for Windows? Hey, wait a minute. I think I did this one before. Welcome to this video on SQL Server on Linux. My name is Kevin Fiesel, and I'm the proprietor of Catalxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. A while back, I released a video on installing SQL Server on Linux. When I released it, there was no support for Ubuntu 22.04, and this was a common theme in the comments section for that video. Well, now Microsoft has opened things up. Amit Khandelwal released a blog post just about a month ago, at least as of the time of this recording, telling us that we can run SQL Server 2022 on Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 and Ubuntu 22.04, and that Microsoft will fully support this scenario. That, and the continued interest of people installing SQL Server on Linux, has got me excited enough that I'm going to do an entire series on SQL Server on Linux. I've got several scenarios planned out, including SQL Server integration services, Polybase, firewall configuration, using Active Directory, failover clustering, and building an availability group. So stick with me over the next several weeks and we'll be SQL Server on Linux DBAs together. Now, as a brief reminder, SQL Server on Linux is still missing a fair amount of functionality compared to SQL Server on Windows. Some of the features here are Windows specific because they require Windows APIs, like FileStream and FileTable. Some of them are currently unsupported, but I expect Microsoft to support them later. And some features, like merge replication, are unsupported simply because nobody wants to manage that code base. At least, that's what I'm expecting. Nonetheless, join me on this quest to stretch the limits of SQL Server on Linux. We have here a fresh installation of Ubuntu 22.04 LTS. If you want to run SQL Server on Linux using a prior version of Ubuntu, that's fine. SQL Server 2022 supports Ubuntu 20.04 as well, and the older versions of SQL Server go back to Ubuntu 16.04. But this video is all about Ubuntu 22.04, so let's do it. By the way, this first part of the installation process is from the SQL Server on Linux Quick Start Guide for Ubuntu. There's a link to it in the description below, so if you want to follow along at home, you can certainly do so. The first thing I need to do is download Microsoft's public key for packages. I'll run a quick curl command to grab the public key and save it in my keyring. My VM doesn't have curl installed by default, so I will need to install it first. There's one thing I want to point out that is not in the Microsoft instructions, but I found was required for my VM. The curl command I just ran creates a GPG public key in /user/share/keyrings, but I need to make a copy of this in /etc/apt/trusted.gpg.d. If I don't, the commands later on in the chain will fail and I won't be able to install SQL Server. After I do this though, I'm going to grab the package list for SQL Server 2022 on Ubuntu 22.04 using another curl command. Note that after the config listing, we have Linux distribution and version. Let's actually take that URL at packages.microsoft.com/config and open it up in a browser. We can see that there are a variety of distributions, but they mostly focus around Red Hat, SUSE, and Debian variants, and Ubuntu is a rather popular Debian variant. If I navigate to the Ubuntu folder, we can see listings for all of the major Ubuntu releases going up to October of 23. But don't think that this means SQL Server is available for all of these variants. As an experiment, I dove into what's available for Ubuntu 23.10, and it does not include any SQL Server tooling. Stick to Ubuntu 22.04 LTS for your SQL Server on Linux needs. Based on prior history, Microsoft will probably only support the long-term support versions of Ubuntu for SQL Server. Okay, diversion aside, let's go back to the VM with a command already in progress. What we're doing here is grabbing the MS SQL Server 2022 package list from this directory and saving it locally. Once I've done that, I need to run sudo apt-get update to refresh my local package listing cache, and then install SQL Server using sudo apt-get install. This will take a little bit of time in order to download the package and install it locally. I will say, however, that it takes quite a bit less time for this installation to complete than SQL Server on Windows does. I think a big part of the reason why is that SQL Server on Linux doesn't have all of the components installed by default, but also because there aren't 2 decades of additional component baggage hanging around, needing to be installed even if you've never heard of the thing and won't use it. But by this point, installation is complete, only a little rambling necessary for it. Though we are going to need to configure SQL Server before we can use it. There is a command to help us do this, msqlconf. Now, if I simply run msqlconf with a parameter of setup, it'll take me through an interactive setup process on the command line. That's what I showed off in the prior SQL Server on Linux video, so let's do it a different way this time. I'm going to create a few environment variables, so let me paste them into the shell here, followed by the msqlconf command. We have 4 environment variables. The first one says that we accept the end user licensing agreement. The second says that we want to use the developer edition of SQL Server. This is a non-production use case, as I'm just demonstrating installation to you, so I can use the free developer edition. If you don't know which editions are available, I would recommend using the interactive setup, as it does give you a nice listing of the options. The third environment variable sets our SA password. The SA account is SQL Server's super user account. Every SQL Server instance has one of these by default, though you can disable it. But at the start, it's the only account we'll have to access this SQL Server instance, so hold off on that until you've set up other accounts. The final environment variable sets the port that SQL Server will listen to over TCP. By default, this is TCP 1433, though you can use any other port number you'd like. Now that I've got these environment variables in place, I can run the configuration program. It has picked up that we have several environment variables set, and so configuration proceeds without a problem and without prompting me for anything. This is an automated solution for us. Once the configuration process is complete, we can check the status of our SQL Server service by using systemctl, or system control. If we want to install SQL Server tools and the ODBC client on this machine, we can do so pretty easily. The first thing I need to do is get the Microsoft prod list for packages. This package listing covers most of what Microsoft supports on Linux, including .NET clients, SQL Server tools, and so on. It's a different package listing from the one for SQL Server, and it's the reason why there were package listings for Ubuntu 22.04 and the like on the Microsoft Packages server. Once we have this in place, we can install SQL Server tools, specifically BCP and SQL Command. I'll let this do its thing for a bit, and then it will ask me to accept some license terms. I'll need to do that twice, and that will let installation complete. The next thing I'd like to do is enable the SQL Server Agent on this machine. As of SQL Server 2019 and SQL Server 2017 CU4, the SQL Server Agent gets installed by default with SQL Server on Linux, but it's not enabled by default. The reason is that Unix-based systems already have a powerful scheduling tool in cron jobs, so the SQL Server Agent is typically a lot less useful than it is on Windows, whose task scheduler is a lot more clunky. To enable the agent is a 2-line command. The first line runs msqlconf and sets the SQL agent on. The second line restarts the SQL Server service. I've executed this and given SQL Server time to restart, so let's connect to it. I'm going to connect to this VM from my primary machine using SQL Server Management Studio on Windows. Last time around, I connected locally using Azure Data Studio, but I want to show that you can use both tools to connect to this, as it's just another SQL Server instance, just one that happens to run on Linux. I'll need to know what my IP address is, so I'll run the ifconfig command and see what it spits out. But to do that on this VM, I need to install a package called nettools. Looking through the listings, I can see an IP address here that is routable locally. I'm not going to get into VM networking in this video. in part because I'm no good at it. But because I'm connecting from the host machine, I don't have to think about it at all. Speaking of connecting, let's switch over to SQL Server Management Studio and connect to a new instance. I'll type in the IP address of the virtual machine, and then I need to switch to SQL Authentication, type in SA as the username, and put in the password. And voila! We have connected to SQL Server on Linux via SQL Server Management Studio on Windows, technically on a different machine. We don't have any user databases or other fanciness set up, but this is a clean start like you'd get on Windows. We'll certainly do a lot more with this instance as we continue the series, but for now, I think this is a good stopping point. Over the course of this video, we downloaded and installed SQL Server 2022 Developer Edition on a Linux VM running Ubuntu 22.04. We also installed the SQL Server Agent, and I showed you how to connect to it from SQL Server Management Studio running on a Windows machine. There's a lot more we can do with SQL Server on Linux, but let's save that for the rest of the series. We'll have links and show notes in the description below, and until we see each other in the next video, take care.